These are some of these remarkable stone vases. Some of the most spectacular are actually elsewhere in the Petrie Museum in London, and if you're at the Louvre, take a look, see what they have there. But you see what's involved here. I mean, this is perhaps the most remarkable. This one and this one. That's a porphyry, which is a impenetrable stone. You know, I mean, these things have hardnesses. Yeah, well, this one's relatively easy in the sense of hollowing it out. I mean, it's beautifully done, but you can see how you might do that with some sort of a hand drill. This is something else again, because it's hollow on the inside, and the thickness of the lip is pretty much the thickness of the walls. Same applies here.
Wow, so how are they?
That's the point, is that these things are perfectly formed. Nobody knows how to do it. We don't know how to do it today. And the point is that this is the interesting bit, these come out of either earliest dynasty Egyptian finds or pre-dynastic finds. In those Neolithic settlements, that's what you found, was very crude pottery and little fish hooks and combs and stuff like that. And then suddenly these things. So it was Paul Roberts, my friend Paul Roberts, who suggested, hey, maybe these are heirlooms from that earlier period, because it doesn't figure that if the rest of the stuff that you're doing are crude little pots, suddenly there's this thing involving a technology, and I mean perfectly geometric. I'm sure if you did a geometric study of these, you'd find golden section ratios and all sorts of stuff like that. I mean, these are complex shapes. I mean, it wouldn't be complex on a potter's wheel. That's diorite. Well, these are all, that one's a green schist, that's a porphyry. These things are, you know, modern sculptors with machine tools would think twice before they attacked something like that. And if they attacked it, they'd be very hard put to get a finish on it like these. Look at that porphyry bowl. It's mind-blowing. So we're thinking that quite possibly these things are handed down because they're indestructible. As long as they don't break or you don't lose them, they're there forever. You leave them out in the weather forever and nothing's going to happen to them even. So this could be an intriguing part of the puzzle. And if it's not a part of our puzzle, then it's absolutely sort of inexplicable in terms of what else they found in these little Neolithic settlements. This is important stuff. The materials used, the stones used to produce these bowls, and also some of the other statues of Egypt, almost defy modern technology. It is exactly the same statue. This is carved out of that special kind of diorite. I said that in indirect lighting glows in the gloom. And I mean, this is an impenetrable rock that when sculptors see this and they look at the finish on it, and you look down even from here, you see where the light is on it? I mean, it's a perfect finish. There isn't a ripple in it. It's almost unbelievable. But one of the really interesting things about this one, as far as I'm concerned, is when you look at it, if you look at it head on, all you see is the king, right? It's only when you get around to the side, that you see the falcon behind his head. Now the falcon represents, of course, higher consciousness, the return to the source, salvation, blah, blah. But the message, to me, is a very deliberate one on the part of the sculptor. He didn't have to do it that way. He can show the falcon bigger. You see even the way the falcon's wings are smoothed down into the headdress so you can't see him. So, in other words, enlightenment is not obvious. In other words, from the front, it's just a king, a very royal king. But from the side, and it's usually said Horus is protecting the king. The king doesn't need any goddamn protection. What's really being symbolized is that he's integrated Horus consciousness into his own. If we look at these magnificent specimens of Old Kingdom art and realize that these are not just works of genius sculpture, but that they enshrine a highly sophisticated metaphysical and scientific doctrine, we begin to realize that ancient Egypt is not as we have been taught, and that this doctrine could not have been developed within a couple of hundred years, and is almost certainly a legacy handed down over the generations from that still earlier civilization. This is called the Narmer palette. Narmer is another name for Mena, or Menes, who's unified Upper and Lower Egypt in dynastic times. Normally said to be a victory over the enemies and all this sort of stuff, and as I mentioned on a number of occasions, the unification of Egypt is supposed to be a purely political measure. This is First Dynasty, supposedly, the beginning of the First Dynasty. I mean, you see the Hathor ears up ahead there. I mean, the Hathor face, again, already intact with the cow ears, and the human face with horns there, instead of normally with the Hathor head, you have the headdress and then the sistrum on top. This may be an earlier form, but Hathor is around from the very, very earliest time. Now, these guys in the center, that's sort of interesting. For those who think, I mean, these occur here, and are, to the best of my knowledge, nowhere else in Egypt, again, ever. And okay, they're mythological animals. There are some people who think, gee, this is a long, the dinosaurs lasted longer than anyone thinks, and that if you're trying to draw a dinosaur by memory, well, who knows? I mean, I certainly would not like to get up in front of the American Society of Rationalists and try to defend that point of view, but it's peculiar. And there is one in Australia, a big argument over whether or not they're real. I can't go into this now. Those are actual Australian Aboriginal hieroglyphs, and these are the Egyptian throwing sticks, which are there. I mean, some of them whistle when they go, some of them are meant to come back to you. This suddenly gets interesting, because all of a sudden you think that maybe there is a connection, and that either the Aussies, the Aborigines got it from the Egyptians, or the Egyptians got it from the Aborigines, but here they are. I mean, no mistaking that those are boomerangs. This is the so-called inventory stela, which tells that Khufu, Cheops, built a temple to Isis alongside the Sphinx. I mean, the Sphinx is there in Khufu's time, and it's not built by Khafre. Well, he was the pharaoh before Khafre, who built the Great Pyramid. So that in and of itself means that the Sphinx is there in Khufu's time. So when did it get built then?
Wow.
The way that the academics weasel their way out of this is that studying the stone, studying these scratchy hieroglyphs, they find that the language is actually late. It's late period hieroglyphs. But the late period was consciously trying to, it was a kind of a retro dynasty. They were consciously reviving the styles and all sorts of, I mean, all kinds of Old Kingdom iconography and Old Kingdom sculptural styles and artistic styles. They were deliberately reconstituting. The language had, of course, changed. So to argue that this is a late kingdom, sort of a late kingdom invention, really begs the issue. It's like saying that a 20th century translation of the Bible isn't really the Bible, because it's not the King James Version and it's not in Aramaic. It's a translation, so really it's a very powerful piece of evidence. It all begins actually from a single line of Schwaller de Lubitsch in one of his ancillary books called, translated now, it is translated as Sacred Science, and the King of the Pharaonic Theocracy, in which he is looking into the Egyptian belief that, or under that belief, knowledge that ancient Egyptians, that ancient Egypt goes way back before dynastic Egypt. I mean, I'm basically doing what Schliemann did when he looked for Troy. He simply took Homer at his word and said, yeah, he's not making up a story. There's a city there somewhere, and he followed the leads in the Odyssey and found Troy. Well, really, we're doing the same thing. The Egyptian texts themselves talk about these long periods, thousands and thousands and thousands of years, when Egypt was ruled first by the Necheru, the gods themselves, and then, which I take to mean realized human beings, godlike human beings. And then another long period when Egypt is ruled by the Shemsu-Hor, which means the companions of the followers of Horus. And the dates given, the Egyptians don't give dates in X number of years, but they actually list the names of the kings who ruled during these long periods and the regnal years. And if you add all of that stuff up, you end up with something like 36,000 years, which of course is unimaginable in the modern idea of how history begins and all the rest. But simply by taking it literally, you end up with a totally different picture of Egypt. So Schwaller was writing this long chapter quoting extensively from these various writers, Pliny and Plutarch and Strabo and all sorts of people. And then at the very end of this chapter said, a throwaway line. And then, of course, the Sphinx has been weathered by water and not by wind and sand. And that was the thing with me that just clicked. Water weathering here in the middle of the Sahara Desert, where there hasn't been any water to speak of for at least 7,000 years. The Sahara itself, a relatively new desert, forming somewhere around 10,000 BC. When I read, and of course, whenever the rainy periods were, it doesn't mean that's when the Sphinx was built. The Sphinx has to have been there to get weathered by the rain. But then now the dating argument comes in, and even those of us who agree that this has to be water weathering, and therefore, at the very least, it has to be older than dynastic Egypt, then the question is how much? And Schoch takes the most conservative position possible, really, allowed by the data, which is about 5,000 to 7,000 BC. And I take the most, I guess, the radical view, but seems to me, in a sense, the most plausible. And again, it's following the Egyptians themselves when they're talking about 34 or 36,000 years. I think that's what it is. There is, at least in principle, a method of trying to settle this dating question. But my own view is that it's this older date, partly because the Egyptians themselves say that's where their civilization began, and then partly because of the I think, the very plausible suggestion that the Sphinx is meant as a marker of the age of Leo. Now, this is another hotbed of controversy, but there's a lot of reason to think that the ancients, very, very ancients, knew about the precession of the equinoxes and the shifts of ages, you know, that goes, we're now at the end of the age of Pisces and coming into the age of Aquarius. And there's plenty of good reason to think that this knowledge of precession goes back into deep, deep antiquity. So if the Sphinx is actually intended as a Leo marker, it only gives you a couple of choices, because the last age of Leo is around 10,000, 10,500 BC. This is the date chosen by Bauval and Hancock for dating the Sphinx, because everything else aligns. And then if you add to that the probability that the Sphinx is looking at its own image in the sky when it rises against the sun at the equinox, you've again got this 10,500 date. The problem with that date, as far as I'm concerned, is that in paleoclimatology, you know, and this is, nobody disagrees with this, that the whole Earth is in chaos at that time, following the breakup of the Ice Age, which happens around 12,000 BC for reasons no one is quite sure. Schoch's written a very good book called Voices of the Rocks, where it's a kind of a state-of-the-art statement on catastrophe theory. So everybody knows that this catastrophe took place. No one's sure why. That's when all the woolly mammoths died and the woolly rhinoceroses, you know, all the mass extinctions, they're called the quaternary extinctions. All this took place. So, from my way of thinking, building all of this incredible stuff requires a long settled and stable civilization. You don't just build things like this in the midst of a worldwide, global, chaotic situation where there are earthquakes all over the place and huge floods and everything's unstuck. So, but nevertheless, the star alignments work for that 10,500 date. But because of these various, let's say, these mitigating factors, I don't like that date. But the only other choice is to push it back another full precessional cycle, which is effectively 26,000 years. That gives you 26,000, that gives you 36,000 BC, which corresponds to the Egyptian texts themselves. So even though it looks outrageous, particularly to an academic, to me, it's the more plausible of the possible scenarios. This is always called a plundered tomb chamber. However, the blocks that comprise it have already been weathered, and yet they're completely protected by the pyramid built over it. It just didn't make any sense. There should be other stuff laying around. It's a tomb chamber. Where's the remains of the sarcophagus and all of that kind of stuff? And I just couldn't look at it, and I'd scratch my head and puzzle over it. And then on one of the trips a couple of years ago, there was somebody with me, who was the editor and publisher of Atlantis Rising magazine. And he was ahead of me as we were coming up here, and I was coming through passageway there, and he was ahead of me, and I heard him say, "Gee, look at that. These are very old rocks. This must have been built first, and the pyramid built around it." And I went, "Ah, yes, of course. You look at these rocks, they can't get into this condition if they're built, if the whole pyramid is built from scratch. These are rocks that have been out in the weather a hell of a long time." And Schank, of course, this is his field, and he now has seen it for himself and concurs. It doesn't look as though they've been subjected to the kinds of heavy rains that the Sphinx has been subjected to in the enclosure walls of the Sphinx. But they've been out in the weather a hell of a long time before the pyramid was built around them. And you look at the style of construction, it doesn't look like the Sphinx and the Valley Temple, it doesn't look like the Osirion. What it does look like, and quite reminiscent of, are some of the larger and more impressive megalithic ruins of England and Scotland and Wales. It has a kind of a Newgrange look rather than an Egyptian look. Well, we're not really sure what we're looking at, Chuck and myself, except that we're damn sure that this is here first. And since we're on higher ground here than the ground level of the plateau, maybe there's something underneath. Maybe it's just an earth formation, but maybe this is on top of something else. We don't know. But what we do know is that this is older than the pyramid, and it is major construction. Those big blocks are probably upwards of 4 tons or thereabouts. They're big chunks of stone to be bandied about. And as you see, they're kind of rough. What we're looking at here is the Valley Temple. It's called the Valley Temple of Khafra. It's adjacent and just to the south of the Great Sphinx. What we're looking at are huge granite blocks applied to a limestone core. Now, it's our conviction that this could not be done in one simple stage, in one stage of construction, because the granite blocks are fitted very carefully to the already pre-weathered limestone. And if this is the case, and it is indeed Khafra who applied the granite, it means that the core masonry, these are blocks that were actually quarried out from the Sphinx enclosure, that core masonry has been weathered in much more ancient times and had the granite applied at some later date, probably by the pharaoh Khafra. But as evidence, look at these peculiar corners. As you see, they're rounded, and in order to form them, they're not stacked up one on the other the way that we would build a corner, but rather the whole face of the huge granite block has been planed away in order to get this inverse quoin, these rounded corners. These are something of a mystery, because there seems to be no really good explanation for going to this much trouble to construct a corner. There are several explanations that have been offered. One is that stereo engineers tell me that in order to produce a true stereo speaker, there cannot be right angles in it or it distorts the sound. It's a possibility that this was a consideration in the building of this temple. Another possibility. There's no Egyptian word for temple. It's called Perneter, which means the home of the god or the principal. And it's meant to be, a living structure, as it were. They're reproducing an organic form as best they can. In other words, a wrist joint or a knee is not an angle, it's an articulation. And it's sort of, in other words, if these things really are energetic structures and there's energy flowing around these things, paramagnetic or whatever energies are intrinsic to stone, and there are energies that are intrinsic to stone, that this is, in other words, it's kind of forming a stone circulatory system that's allowing the energy to flow. Now this sounds a bit new agey, but to me that's consonant with the way the Egyptians went about, how they thought things out. It could be that if these are indeed energetic structures meant as living buildings, living architecture, these corners are reproducing the way that energy flows around an organic form through our bodies. It seems to me that you have to have something seriously wrong with your head to imagine that this is built by the same guy who built that temple. I mean, it's just inconceivable. And my own reckoning is that in all likelihood, when Seti was building his temple, he sort of stumbled on this, which was already covered with sand, and then skewed his own temple around, because it's very unusual temple architecture, that one with the 2 hypostyle halls here, and then suddenly the whole thing goes off goes off to the left like this. This is not a way that they would normally build a temple. And I think it's because he came across the Osirion and then realized all covered up with sand, and then Seti put in the sandstone casing blocks, and probably the blocks that are behind the sandstone. You see over here, they sort of put in these packing blocks behind here. My conviction was that this is originally on floodplain. In other words, like Stonehenge. This is initially not cut into the ground. It's on at ground level. And one of my questions when Jacques first got signed on board was, is that rock back there? It looks like kind of very rough, crummy rock, or is it impacted Nile silt? And Jacques took one look at it and said, oh yes, this is impacted Nile silt. And so it's known, there are geological studies that in very, very ancient times, different studies, and we have to look into these actually, we've not just had the time to do so, 12,000, 14,000 years ago or thereabouts, there was Nile floods much, much higher than today. You see, today's floods would only have gone up to the very bottom of where we left the bus. That's where the floodplain came up to. Well, here we're way above that level here. And that's all impacted Nile silt. So at some point or another in the distant past, there were Nile floods that took the sand level, that took the silt level up to here. So now it's a question, when we were here last, Chuck and myself, we took some unofficial samples there because you can date Nile silt because it's got organic material in it. So ballpark, when you get back that kind of age, it tends to be not too accurate. But in theory, we should be able to date that silt. That doesn't tell us exactly when this was built, but it does tell us when the silt is laid down. And if this is there before that, well, then we're on to something very difficult for the academics to simply dismiss that kind of evidence when you add it in with all of the other kind of evidence.